Imagine standing before an object built by human hands, yet carrying a force no one could explain. It was not a weapon forged for war. It was not an ordinary symbol of an ancient religion. And even so, the rule was absolute. No one could touch it, not out of reverent courtesy, but out of a deep, paralyzing, justified fear. Because more than once, when someone approached it the wrong way, the result was immediate and fatal. The question echoing across 3,000 years is impossible to avoid. What was really there, and what made the Ark of the Covenant so dangerous to the touch of a human hand? The Ark of the Covenant is, without question, the most enigmatic, revered, and dangerous artifact in the entire biblical narrative. For the ancient nations of the Middle East, the gods were visible. They were carved from cold stone, cast in bronze, or shaped in wood, made in the image of man or beast. But the people of Israel, wandering through a merciless wilderness, carried something entirely different with them. There was no face to look upon, no statue to bow before. There was only a geometric structure, a masterfully crafted chest, designed not to be God himself, but to serve as the tangible seat of his indescribable glory on earth. That sacred chest was not merely part of some distant ritual or a ceremonial ornament tucked away inside a peaceful tent. The Ark sat at the gravitational center of everything. It set the rhythm and the direction for millions of people crossing barren sands. Later, it would be carried straight to the front lines of bloody wars, acting like a ruthless battle standard that filled enemy armies with dread and confusion. And in its final destination, it would rest inside the Holy of Holies in the Temple at Jerusalem, the darkest, quietest, most inaccessible place in the entire nation, where only one man, once a year, was allowed to enter. And even he, the high priest, stepped in trembling, surrounded by the thick scent of incense, so he would not lose his life. Neighboring nations heard the rumors and trembled. Reports spread through the ancient world about a box of wood and gold marching at the front of that exiled people, a box that seemed to hold the power to part waters, bring down impregnable walls, and wipe out entire armies. Philistines, Canaanites, and Amalekites broke into a cold sweat at the mere mention of what traveled in the center of the Hebrew camp. And yet, the terror the Ark inspired in enemies was not as great as the deadly fear it demanded from the very people chosen to carry it. If enemies fell for standing in its path, the Israelites themselves could be struck down simply for stepping one pace too close, or for acting with a familiarity they had no right to show. And that is exactly what makes it so haunting. What surrounded the Ark was not just respect or devotion. It was an incomprehensible lethality. Around that object revolved strict rules, absolute boundaries, and protocols of approach that could never be ignored. These laws of distance were not poetic metaphors. They were not moral suggestions from overly cautious leaders. They were hard physical boundaries, with consequences no sane person would dare test twice. The rule was crystal clear. Improper approach and direct touch meant instant death. No warning, no second chance. To the modern mind, trained to explain the world through microscopes, physics, and absolute rationality, it is almost disturbing to imagine how a physical, lifeless object could unleash something so sudden and destructive. We live in an age of access, where everything can be touched, measured, and stripped of mystery. But 3,000 years ago, the reality surrounding this object seemed to rise above every known law of nature. The Ark of the Covenant appeared to establish an invisible field around itself, a kind of spiritual voltage too intense for the frailty of the human body to endure. Across the historical records that survived the centuries, there is clear evidence that the deadly force surrounding it was not just a legend told around campfires to keep the curious away from the Tabernacle. The danger was real, fatal, and unquestionable. The story of the Ark is a saga marked by heavenly wonders, miracles of provision, and victories against all odds. But it is also scarred by dark and inexplicable tragedies. Those who dared to cross the boundaries laid down with such precision, whether through reflex, reckless curiosity, or blind arrogance, discovered in a flash that the line separating supreme holiness from the profane was not some theological concept to be debated. It was a death sentence. And to truly begin understanding why all of this happened, to understand how and why an object of highest worship became a source of mortal terror, we have to go back to the very moment it was conceived. We have to travel back in time and space, straight into the harsh wilderness of Sinai, where the divine architect handed one man the most dangerous, detailed, and fearsome design humanity had ever been commanded to build. The Sinai Desert shows no mercy. It is a brutal expanse of jagged stone, burning sand, and crushing heat by day, giving way to biting cold at night. Picture yourself there. Feel the dust in your throat and the weight of uncertainty in your chest. Thousands of families, men, women, and children, former slaves freshly delivered from generations of forced labor, lashes, and humiliation in Egypt, now camped at the foot of a mountain wrapped in dark clouds and constant lightning. The air smelled of smoke and raw fear, and it was in that very scene, in a moment of extreme vulnerability and human disorientation, that the unimaginable happened. The creator of the universe did not give Moses only a moral code or a set of laws for surviving in those barren lands. He delivered the most terrifying, detailed, and uncompromising architectural and engineering plan on record. The Ark of the Covenant was not the product of a leader's imagination, trying to forge an identity for his people. It was not improvised. It was born from a precise command, spoken word by word, measured cubit by cubit, on the summit of that mountain wrapped in darkness. Think for a moment about the calloused hands of the Hebrew craftsmen, led by men like Bezalel. These were men who had spent their youth raising monuments for flesh and blood pharaohs, shaping mud and straw beneath the eyes of merciless overseers. Now their rough hands were being summoned to build the throne of the invisible, and the materials chosen for the ark tell a story of pain and redemption all by themselves. The structural base of the chest was to be made of acacia wood. Acacia is not a majestic, noble, upright tree like the cedars of Lebanon. It is a desert tree, twisted, thorny, incredibly hard, able to survive the harshest droughts. It is the wood of pure endurance, almost a poetic reflection of the humanity standing there, rough, stubborn, wounded by the storms of life. But that rugged wood, marked by the scars of the desert, was to be entirely overlaid with pure gold, hammered gold, inside and out. The human and the divine forcibly intertwined, the utter frailty of organic matter covered by the imperishable glory of the most precious metal on earth. The sweat and anxiety of those workers mixed with the blinding shimmer under the merciless Middle Eastern sun. Try to picture Bezalel holding his breath as he gave the piece its final polish, knowing that once it was consecrated, he would never again be free to gaze upon his own masterpiece. And there was one detail in that design, something that might have seemed ordinary at first glance, that already sounded like a prelude to the terror still to come, an engineering instruction that felt like a funeral warning. The divine command required 4 solid gold rings to be cast and fixed to the ark's feet. Through those rings, 2 long poles were to be inserted, also made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. Up to that point, for a nomadic people, it might have sounded like nothing more than a practical solution for transportation. But the command came with a chilling addition, recorded in the ancient writings: "The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. they shall never be removed from it. Pause for a second and feel the psychological weight of that demand. In any human piece of furniture, the carrying handles are removed once the object reaches its destination, so it can rest in peace. Not with the ark. Those long poles extending outward were the final physical boundary. A constant, rigid, threatening visual reminder, saying in absolute silence, "Only this far. Do not dare come any closer." Imagine the nervous tension of the Kohathites, the only priestly family authorized to bear that crushing weight on their shoulders. With every unsteady step across the desert dunes, only inches from their sweating faces, rested the point of contact with the consuming fire of the Almighty. They felt the wood flecks slightly beneath the weight of solid gold, the sun burning the backs of their necks, their breath running short, and they knew one inescapable truth. One badly judged stumble on the stones of the trail, one instinctive gesture to steady the sacred chest, would not end in a rebuke or an ordinary accident. It would end in immediate annihilation. The Ark of the Covenant was born already surrounded by a deadly force field, built from human fear and sealed by divine justice. The object ceased to be merely wood and metal. It began to pulse like something alive, untouchable, impenetrable. From the very first day, the people of Israel felt a chill run down their spine. This was not an amulet to be embraced, and it was never meant to be fully grasped by finite minds. And the final proof of why all that deadly weight surrounded it was not only in its gleaming outer shell, but in what Moses, with trembling hands, placed inside the dark and heavy depths of that fatal chest. Think about what the human mind usually imagines when it pictures an ancient chest locked away and heavily guarded. Stolen gold, buried diamonds, lost spells, maps to immortality. But what lay hidden in the dark womb of the Ark of the Covenant was, in truth, a disturbing mirror of the human soul itself. Inside, there were no relics of power in the magical sense Hollywood loves to invent. What rested in the silence of that chest was the raw, tangible, undeniable memory of 3 moments when humanity stumbled, failed miserably, and the divine had to step in. First, the tablets of the law. And there is a deep and painful irony in their presence. We are not talking about the first tablets, the ones the Creator himself carved into untouched stone. Those Moses shattered against the ground in a burst of blind fury when he came down from the mountain and found the people, freshly delivered by miracle, pathetically worshipping a golden calf made from melted earrings. The tablets placed inside the ark were the second set, the second chance. They stood as undeniable proof that the law was too heavy, a moral demand almost impossible for our fragile nature to fulfill. Those cold stones inside that wooden chest cried out in silence about the boundaries man keeps crossing. The law inside, naked and non-negotiable, demanded perfection. And no man had that to give. Beside the stones rested a golden jar filled with manna. That mysterious bread, fragile and sweet like honey, falling from heaven every dawn, so that millions of stomachs would not shrivel in the desert dunes. Yes, it was a tender symbol of constant care, but it was also the embarrassing testimony of an ungrateful people, a people who complained every day, who longed for the onions and garlic of slavery in Egypt, who doubted at every dry well whether they had been led out there to die of thirst. The preserved manna was proof that heaven provided, but also proof that human trust has a shamefully short expiration date. And finally, Aaron's rod, a dead stick, a dry branch, cut off from every root, drained of sap, stripped of all possibility of life. When leadership was challenged in rage by rebels, swallowed up by envy and the hunger for power, No speech could settle the matter. Left overnight in the tabernacle, that dead wood sprouted, blossomed, and produced ripe almonds by morning. A violent miracle of biological reversal. The rod remained in the darkness of the ark as an eternal reminder that the authority of life springs up wherever mystery decrees it. And to rebel against that, driven by pride, is to flirt with your own destruction. And yet the true magnetic terror, the thing that made priests' blood run cold, was not at the bottom of the chest. It was above it. The lid, known as the mercy seat, that covering was not acacia overlaid with gold. It was a brutal, solid slab of pure gold, hammered into shape by heavy blows, and rising from it were two terrifying figures, the cherubim. Forget the Renaissance image of chubby babies with little wings plucking harps. In the ancient world of the Middle East, these winged figures were chimeric beasts, fierce guardians standing at the threshold between the world of men and heavenly realities. They were sculpted with bowed faces, their eyes fixed on the center of the lid, their wings stretched outward and upward, covering the middle like a golden canopy, dark and silent. And why were those golden sentinels there, standing guard, facing the empty center? Because for that people, the space was not empty. In the mindset of the ancient Israelites, that exact dark space between the wings of the cherubim was ground zero. It was the place where the infinite tore into the finite. It was the very seat of divinity in the dust of the earth, the visible manifestation of unbearable glory, the Shekinah. A glory that, in the accounts, took shape as a dense, turbulent cloud by day and a blazing pillar of fire by night. The ark was not a box for storing memories. It was the anchoring point of the throne of the universe. And here is where its lethal power begins to make cold, logical sense. Think of the sun itself. The sun warms us, gives us life, makes the earth bring forth food. But if a man, in his arrogance, tried to fly up and embrace the sun, he would not be punished because the sun hated him or wanted revenge. He would be instantly obliterated because his corruptible physical nature simply has no capacity to endure the blazing essence of that star. The holiness radiating from the mercy seat worked in exactly that way, like an extreme form of spiritual radiation. When a human being, carrying the weight of mortality, everyday stains and broken motives, tried to lay a hand on what housed the presence, the contact became biologically unsustainable. The distance required was not the sadistic whim of an invisible tyrant. It was a merciful quarantine, necessary to keep man alive before an immeasurable force. And that is precisely why, for anyone to even look at this object from afar, terrifyingly exact rules had to be established. Rules demanding the blood of innocents, sacred garments, and ritual washings. Boundaries that, if ignored for even a single second, would cause any human body to perish in the fire of glory. Imagine the psychological burden of being the man assigned to handle the Ark of the Covenant. To an outside observer, belonging to the family of Kohath might have seemed like an unmatched privilege, the spiritual elite of Israel. But on the ground, in the middle of the camp, the reality was dark. That task was a lethal burden. Constant proximity to the ark drained the human soul through the sheer exhaustion of fear. They knew the line between reverence and instant death was as thin as a strand of hair. The handling rules allowed no room for improvisation or good intentions. When the divine cloud rose, signaling the nation to move, a surgical protocol began. The Kohathites could not simply walk into the tent and grab the poles. That would have been instant suicide. They waited outside, drenched in cold sweat. First, the priests entered. often walking backward, took down the thick veil of the sanctuary and covered the ark. Only after a triple wrapping of animal skins and blue cloth, completely neutralizing the visual danger, could the carriers come near and lift the crushing weight by the poles. Direct contact with the golden structure was absolutely forbidden, and the requirement for distance did not stop there. Once the ark finally moved out, leading the march, divine instruction demanded an empty space of about half a mile between it and the people. Picture the scene in cinematic detail, an endless sea of human beings walking in reverent silence, while nearly a kilometer ahead, alone and wrapped in a blue mantle, the ark cut through the hot desert air. That physical void was the ruthless visual demonstration that flawed minds and mortal bodies were not made to bear the radiation of holiness. It did not matter how noble the intention or how sincere the love in someone's heart might be. The law was mechanical and impersonal. Even the high priest needed a shield to survive. When he entered the little chamber of the ark once a year, he was required to carry smoking censers, creating a heavy curtain of smoke, a blind shield, an artificial barrier, just so his mortal eyes would not focus on the brilliance of the mercy seat and cause him to drop dead on the spot. That artifact was, in human terms, a spiritual time bomb surrounded by short fuses. The tension was meant to remain unbroken, but human nature forgets. It adapts, and tragically, it fails. It was only a matter of time before years of familiarity turned into carelessness, and one single second of carelessness in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant was about to demand an immediate and merciless price. Time moved on, and the rigid lessons of the desert slowly faded from the nation's memory. Centuries after its creation, at the political and military height of his reign, King David decided to bring the sacred artifact to his new capital, Jerusalem. But the atmosphere was not one of trembling reverence. It was a celebration on an almost overwhelming scale. Picture 30,000 chosen men marching together while the air throbbed with the crashing sound of lyres, harps, tambourines, and cymbals. The king himself danced before a crowd in ecstasy. It was a kind of collective spiritual intoxication, a joy so deafening it smothered the memory that this object had already taken lives. But in the middle of that proud celebration, a fatal mistake was already moving with them. In the rush to stage a grand national event, they simply ignored the survival manual given at Sinai. The ark was not being carried on the shoulders of priests by the acacia poles. In a dangerous attempt to innovate, to modernize the transport, they placed it on a brand new ox cart. It was practical, yes, but it was also a cheap imitation of the way pagan nations moved their idols. The line of absolute separation was broken for the sake of convenience. The procession moves forward. The music hits its highest frenzy. Then they arrive at the threshing floor of Nacon. The ground there was uneven, raw, unforgiving. And suddenly, the unpredictable tears through the narrative. The heavy oxen pulling the cart lose their footing and stumble hard. The massive gold-covered chest jerks violently, slipping on the platform just inches away from crashing into the dirt of the road. And in that split second, time seems to freeze. Walking beside the wheel of the cart was a man named Uzzah. He was not an enemy. He was not a profane thief. He was a caretaker, assigned to watch over the load. When he sees the ark about to slam into the mud, his body reacts before his mind can even measure the danger. It was an automatic, desperate, human reflex. Uzzah reaches out, opens his hand, and presses his fingers against the side of solid gold to steady the artifact. He managed to stop the fall, but the price of that protective touch was immediate. There was no lightning, no thunder, no divine warning. There was only a cold, surgical, instantaneous annihilation. The lethal force ignited the exact moment Uzzah's skin touched the object. He dropped dead on the spot, struck down by a spiritual charge that the biology of his corrupted body had no way to absorb or survive. The dull thud of his body hitting the dry earth sliced through the music like a guillotine. The tambourines went silent at once. The cry of joy from 30,000 people froze into a silent, agonizing terror. The tragedy shocked everyone because, to mortal eyes, it seemed unfair. Uzzah's intention was noble, to keep God from the dirt, but his sudden death drove a painful truth deep into the soul of the nation. Mud, created by God himself, does not defile his purity. What crosses the deadly line is the subtle presumption that divine glory needs flawed human hands to save it from the ground. The gulf between the sacred and the human cannot be crossed, not even with the best intentions. The trauma of that afternoon was so devastating that King David himself, overcome by visceral fear and a rage he could not understand, ordered everything to stop. He turned away, too afraid to go on, and left the ark right there, in the house of a stranger along the HDRKH. The relentless power of the Ark of the Covenant was not limited to punishing careless familiarity among its own guardians. When the object was treated like nothing more than a magical charm, the terror it unleashed became even more devastating. Decades before the tragedy of Uzzah, Israel made a mistake that would cost them dearly. Desperate in a bloody battle against the Philistines, the Hebrew leaders brought the ark to the front lines. They believed the mere physical presence of the chest would force heaven to hand them victory. But the sacred does not bend to human manipulation. Israel was slaughtered on the plains. And then the unthinkable happened. The ark was captured by the enemy. To the Philistine warriors, that was the ultimate triumph. In the ancient world, capturing a people's central relic was undeniable proof that your own gods were stronger. Swollen with arrogance, they carried the golden chest to the city of Ashdod and locked it inside the temple of Dagon, their fertility god. The ark now rested in the darkness of a pagan sanctuary, displayed like a hunting trophy, but the soldiers' illusion of control lasted exactly one night. When the priests opened the heavy wooden doors the next morning, they found an impossible scene. The gigantic statue of Dagon had fallen face down, stretched out in a posture of absolute humiliation before the Israelite ark. They lifted the idol back onto its pedestal, sweating cold, trying to convince themselves it had only been an earthquake. But at dawn on the second day, the message was graphic and irreversible. Dagon had not simply fallen again. His heavy head and the palms of his hands had been violently severed and thrown across the threshold. Without making a sound, the golden chest had mutilated the Philistine god. And that invisible confrontation did not remain confined to the stones of the temple. Terror quickly spilled into the streets. Soon after the idol fell, a sudden plague of painful tumors struck the entire population of Ashdod. The military pride of a whole nation collapsed into paralyzing panic. Trying to rid themselves of the curse, the rulers sent the ark to another Philistine city, Gath. The result was exactly the same: plague, chaos, and death. When they tried to send it to a third city, Ekron, the inhabitants cried out in horror before the cart even reached the gates. For 7 agonizing months, the greatest war prize of the Philistines moved through their own territory, leaving a trail of uncontrollable destruction. They no longer wanted the gold or the glory of possessing that trophy. They only wanted to stay alive. That massive artifact proved to the pagan world that the power hovering between the golden cherubim could not be imprisoned. Ruthlessly destroying from the inside out, anyone who dared claim dominion over it. After centuries of exhausting journeys, impossible victories, and sudden deaths, the Ark of the Covenant finally found its rest. King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, a dazzling feat of engineering whose dark and silent heart, the Holy of Holies, was designed specifically to house that golden chest. There, protected by walls of solid stone, it remained the spiritual anchor of Israel. But the story of man is written in blood and collapse, and the most heavily guarded artifact in the ancient world was about to become the center of its final and greatest mystery: its disappearance without a trace. In the year 586 BC, the relentless armies of Babylon, under the command of King Nebuchadnezzar, tore through the defenses of Jerusalem. The city was besieged, destroyed, and burned. Solomon's glorious temple was reduced without mercy to ashes. The Babylonians, famous for their military bureaucracy, recorded in detail every item looted from the sacred sanctuary. Bowls, pillars, bronze shovels. Everything was carefully catalogued for exile. Everything except the most powerful item of all. The Ark simply does not appear in the strict Babylonian list of plunder. It vanishes from the biblical and historical record. There is not a single account saying the chest was melted down, broken apart, or captured by Nebuchadnezzar. That deafening silence in the ancient texts opened the door to centuries of feverish theories. Did the prophet Jeremiah, warned of the coming fall, hide the relic in isolated caves on Mount Nebo? Was it lowered and sealed inside the dark labyrinthine tunnels that still exist beneath the Temple Mount? Or, as old traditions claim, was it secretly taken to Ethiopia, where it rests under the watch of secluded monks? No one knows. No modern excavation has found a single trace of that wood or that gold. And in a way, that is the most fitting ending such an object could have. The Ark demanded absolute distance. It did not tolerate curiosity. It punished profane human touch with death. And in the end, it refused to be touched even by time itself. It escaped the greed of empires. It simply withdrew into the shadows of history, keeping its lethal power and its mysteries safe, far from the eyes of a world that never truly knew how to deal with it. The Ark of the Covenant was never just a chest of wood and gold. It was never a magical weapon, a lucky charm, or a war trophy. When we look at its story carved into time, at its merciless boundaries, and at the sudden terror that struck well-meaning men like Uzzah, the answer to our opening question becomes frighteningly clear. Why could no one touch it? Because human beings, hopelessly bound to a fragile and fallen nature, simply do not possess the spiritual or biological capacity to withstand the crushing weight of absolute purity. The lethality of that artifact was not the capricious rage of a tyrant, but the relentless physics of holiness itself. Just as shadow is erased by the violent light of a star, mortality collapsed the moment it touched the presence of the Creator. The half-mile gap in the desert, the thick blue coverings, the immovable poles. None of that was punishment. It was a surgical act of mercy. A quarantine meant to keep man alive. A warning that glory becomes lethal to anyone who approaches it with the false illusion of control. Today, 3 millennia later, the Ark's whereabouts remain an absolute mystery, hidden and untouched by time. But its story survives like an unsettling mirror. We live in an age that believes it can unravel the universe and bring everything under the touch of human hands. And yet that golden chest rises out of the dust of history as an overwhelming reminder that some boundaries cannot be crossed. The Ark teaches us that the sacred does not submit to human logic. We are the ones who must step back and accept that certain forces were never meant to be mastered by mortal hands, only reverenced with unbreakable and absolute fear.